in a way that Springfield is doing today. I want to highlight one woman, Doris Bailey. Doris, can you please rise? I know you hate me doing this, but I want you to stand up, please. She's really been the heart and soul of getting this going and conducting the meetings and bringing people together, and has just done an outstanding job. And yesterday she gave the first talk to open this up and did a great job, and I also want to commend her because her husband's in eternal glory now, and that happened recently, and she recognized him at the beginning of the talk. She said, if he was here, he'd be in the front row. And I appreciate her doing the talk with all the emotions that I brought up, and as I told you, I look forward to having conversation with him in the future. So thanks so much, Doris, for all that you've done. This is a tough history, and in my former vocation in the National Park Service, I worked with a variety of different communities as they struggled to install markers or hold programs to remember some of the most difficult history in their community's past. And it has not been without controversy. And one community I worked closely with was the community of Memphis, Tennessee. And a remarkable group of people got together and established the Lynching Sites Project of Memphis. And they made it their goal to put up a marker for every single lynching that occurred in the Memphis area. There were over 30 that occurred, a variety of different ages, a variety of different genders. I made a point of always being there for the dedication ceremonies. But due to a scheduling conflict for one particular one, I couldn't be there. And the first chance I came up, I went down to Memphis, and with 2 members of the LSP, we drove out to see the marker. When we got out of the car, I started walking towards it, but they held back. And these are people I know very well. I said, you're going to come with me? And they said, when you get to that marker, there's a strip mall right nearby. There's going to be a white man that comes out of those stores. He's going to make a beeline to you, and he's going to give you the riot act. And now I've been criticizing my Park Service career in print and person. I was used to it. But I was in plain clothes. I was just going to read this marker. He would have no idea I had any association with providing funding to establish it. But I went over, started reading, and just as they predicted, he bolted out of that store, made a beeline for me, and he criticized me in every which way he could. What shocked me was 3 times, almost like a refrain, he kept saying this phrase, we should just do happy history. Just because we're horrified by this doesn't mean we should ignore it, doesn't mean it didn't exist. All the more reason we should study it. When I left that conversation, if you want to call it that, I was really fearful that we're having 2 Americas. One that knows this history and one that does not. So I was asked by Doris Bailey to talk about Joe James. And Trinity Lutheran Church, this church, its congregation dates back to the 1840s. And Reverend Dresser is considered our founder. He founded 2 Lutheran churches here. He lived right across the street from Abraham Lincoln and knew Lincoln very well, and we actually have correspondence between them. He founded was today Grace Lutheran Church and what you are in today, Trinity Lutheran Church. The reason for the 2 churches, Grace was the English-speaking one, this was the German-speaking one. And it has a very rich history connected with the 1908 race riot, connected with Joe James. Joe James was born in the South. He came up here in 1908, part of a massive migration of African Americans from the South to the North, believing they could have a better life up here. He hitched a train ride in 1908 from St. Louis to Chicago, and for some reason he got off the train here in Springfield. He's a musician, he's a pianist. He decided he would make his life here. When he got off that train, he had no idea he had less than 6 months to live. He did a variety of jobs, and one night he had a tendency, we have some records about that, he was so tired he'd simply fall asleep out in the open. There's no crime in that, no hurt, no foul. But he happened to fall asleep close enough to the home of Clergy Ballard. Clergy Ballard was a white man, very popular here in Springfield, Illinois. And one night, an assailant entered his house. He beat him off. They had a fight in the front yard. He was stabbed multiple times and died the next day. His son's family and some others searched to try to find the attacker. And for some reason, they came across this young 17-year-old teenager asleep blocks away. They suddenly decided that he must have been the assailant. They beat him up, they assaulted him, they dragged him until the police came and then arrested him for the crime based on what they had said. But the fundamental question here is why? Why would they naturally assume an African American man was responsible for this attack? Well, to answer that question, we have to go back, not to the 1800s, not to the 1700s, but all the way back to the 1600s when the seeds of this were planted in our soil. When the Europeans discovered the Western Hemisphere, there was a motivation to obviously spread Christianity, but there was also a motivation to make a profit. The Spanish ended up in the best position of them all. With South America, they found gold and silver in abundance. And their ships filled with that treasure transited both the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean, significantly enriching the Spanish throne. The English, Dutch, and French ended up with the Caribbean. No gold, there was no silver, but they found there was one crop that grew very well there, which was very profitable at the time, and that was sugar. Now, they used enslaved Africans they imported from the continent of Africa to run these plantations. And they also found out the most profitable way to run these was to work these people to their deaths and then bring in new enslaved Africans to replace them. The average lifespan of the sugar plantations in the Caribbean was 3 to 4 years. If you visit England and you see any of the large mansions, the plantations they have there, if they were built in the 1700s, I guarantee you they were built on wealth from the backs and the blood of enslaved Africans in the Caribbean. Now, for the English colonists that ended up in what was today the United States, there was no gold, there was no silver, and they couldn't grow sugar. But they did develop an economy based on slavery, all the way from what is today Maine, all the way down to Georgia. Tobacco, indigo, products like that. But in the late 1600s, those that were profiting from that system of slavery ran into a problem due to the Christian church. Because up to that point, in the English colonies, the difference between free and slave was whether you're Christian or non-Christian. And the Christians were starting to baptize the enslaved. So the political and business leaders had to come up with a different model. How can we preserve our economic system in the face of this threat? So the colony of Maryland was the first one to pass a law that said the difference between free and enslaved was black or white, knowing well that baptism would not change the color of their skin. The other colonies saw the ingenuity of this and they adopted the same measure. The Christian church pushed back again. What difference does it make the color of one's skin? So right there in the late 1600s, a cottage industry develops, what we today would describe as white supremacy, to justify this economic system. And they came up with every possible way, skin color, intelligence, the way they spoke, anything to justify keeping this economic system in place. So generations before Thomas Jefferson would write the words, "All men are created equal," these colonists have been told that this is the proper way of things. And for those making money off it, they had every reason in the world to perpetuate this philosophy. There's no better point in American history to see the battle between two perspectives, Jefferson's words on white supremacy, than here in Illinois in the 1858 Lincoln-Douglas debates. Now, sometimes when we look at the debates, we look at it almost comical or caricature. Lincoln 6'4", thin, Douglas 5'4", rotund. But you look at the words that they were saying and the arguments they were making. Some of the things that Douglas said would be appalling for anyone to say today. In Bloomington, Illinois, before the debate started, Douglas gave what I would say his most substantial speech in the entire campaign. It was based on one premise, which he said very explicitly. He told the voters of Illinois this nation had been founded by the white people for the white race and for their posterity forever. He even went through and described superior races and the inferior races. Now, Lincoln generally would attack that with Jefferson's words, all men are created equal. Douglas was a very experienced politician. He knew the voters well. He knew what would win, and his party won, based on that philosophy. Now, as we move into the 1860s and the Civil War, historians in the 1960s came to the conclusion correctly that slavery was the cause of the war. Lincoln says it in his second inaugural address. Grant says it in his memoirs in 1885. We even have the Vice President of the Confederacy saying it. But as we look at that time period today, we're starting to see a new view emerge. Maybe there was something else along with slavery. Because if slavery was the only cause of the Civil War, why did we need a civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s? Just because you pass the 13th Amendment one day doesn't mean white America wakes up the next day and believes everyone's equal. Generations have been taught about white supremacy, and that continued after the end of the Civil War. And we saw what was to become of that first in Memphis a year after the war ended. For those who believed in white supremacy, one of the greatest offenses was when they saw an African-American man holding a rifle. There was something about that bothered them more than anything else. So when Lincoln and Frederick Douglass worked together to arm African Americans to serve in the United States Army, this was a direct threat on this philosophy. And in Memphis, for the first year after the war, there were several United States Army African American regiments patrolling the streets and keeping the order. But on April 30th, those men were mustered out and free. And on May 1st, what we today know as the Memphis Massacre began. Over 3 days, over 40 African Americans were killed, 5 African American women raped. It wasn't until Grant finally pleading with the White House was allowed to have other federal troops come in and stop it. The whites also targeted 2 institutions, recognizing their power within the African American community. They burned down every black church, and they burned down every black school. Grant wanted to prosecute, and he pleaded with Johnson to do that. Johnson checked with his attorney general. His attorney general said, "We have no say here." And basically, by doing that, Johnson was saying, giving them free rein. And we start to see the end of the period we know as Reconstruction. In New Orleans, just months later, you have another massacre occurs there, and then lynching, all the violence that we know today, continues, perpetuates through Reconstruction. In the late 1800s, one historian has estimated that an African American was lynched once every 3 days. Which brings us to 1908, to Springfield, Illinois, and Joe James. These people had no idea. They were bowing before a philosophy that had been created hundreds of years before for an economic system that no longer existed, but that was perpetuating the course that they were going to drive Joe James. Not everybody in Springfield supported what had done. One individual who was born in New York, traveled around the country, woke up one morning, he saw the fires coming, the smoke coming from where the buildings had been burned. He saw National Guard troops camped on the new state capitol grounds. And he decided to stand up and do something. He was a pastor of Brand, the pastor of Trinity Lutheran Church here. He volunteered, he went to Joe James in his jail cell, became one of his spiritual advisors. But he was not alone. He was joined by another pastor at Holy Trinity Lutheran Church on the other side of town, African-American, 23-year-olds fresh out of seminary. And both of them were listed consistently in the newspaper as meeting with Joe James, at risk to themselves, to their families, and to their congregations. And especially for Doswell to stand up after everything had been done was an extraordinarily bold step by this young African-American man. Now, I'm not quite sure what they thought about James' guilt or innocence, but we do have some indication. At one point, a false rumor emerged, covered in the newspapers, that James had said that he was in fact guilty of Clergy Ballard's murder. Both Pastor Brand and Pastor Doswell came out of the newspaper and said that was categorically false. He had made no such statement and continued to stand by it. The trial was really a farce. At one point, his mom made the point that he was only 17 years old. For the sheriff and the prosecutor, this was a huge problem, because at that age, they couldn't put him to death. This was exactly what they wanted to do. And so they simply declared that Joe James was 23 years old, now old enough to be put to death. He was quickly found guilty, sentenced to be hanged. Sangamon County, near where the old state capitol is, pulled out that wooden gallows. And over 100 white people came there that day to watch this. They not only wanted James to die, they wanted to watch this young musician die. But he was not alone. He was accompanied by two people on the gallows, Pastor Brand and Pastor Doswell. And think about Doswell, this 23-year-old African-American, facing a crowd that had come to see Joe James die. Now, at some point, these two pastors must have realized that there was no human reprieve coming. So they would have had an opportunity before the noose was placed around this 17-year-old's neck to tell him, Joseph, today you will be in paradise. I like to say that Doswell's story has a happy ending, but a year later, he's married, and he leaves Springfield. I can't but assume that having watched everything that happened here, he was not going to raise his family here. He takes a call at a church in St. Louis. Sadly, he gets tuberculosis, and he dies at the age of 32. Now, when we talk about the 1908 race riot, we talk about it as nationally significant. One of the most important factors of that, we talk about the founding of the NAACP. But what impact did that have? Lynchings occurred afterwards. What is the national significance if they did not stop? Well, in 1917, down in Memphis, Tennessee, there was a young girl, 15 years old, and she went missing. Her family found her bicycle near a bridge, kickstand down, just standing upright. When they went into the woods, they found her body. She had been killed, and her body had been decapitated. Now, the evidence at the scene, the upright bicycle, indicates it was somebody that her attacker was somebody she knew. It was an expensive white coat and tire tracks. Obviously, somebody of some means. But instead, just like what happened here, they assumed it must have been an African American and looked for the closest one that lived nearby, and they found a man, a woodcutter, by the name of L. Persons. He had been married a year before, and they had a young child. We don't know the gender. They arrested him. At that time, according to law enforcement, a confession, no matter how obtained, was considered admissible to court. They beat this young husband, this young dad. They actually used electrocution until finally they got what they termed to be a confession. They took him out of Memphis for his protection. But when they brought him back, for some reason, the train stopped. And there happened to be a group of white men there who boarded the train, seized him, and took him away. And then it was announced in the newspaper where they were going to lynch him, right where the young girl had been murdered. 5,000 white people showed up. It was a carnival atmosphere. They were selling trinkets, giving food. Children were dismissed from school to go watch this. They took out persons, tied him to a log, sprayed his body with gasoline, and lit him on fire. And the crowd cheered. Again, looking back at 1908, it would be hard to make a case that this had any difference, but something happened shortly thereafter, which we can point back to 1908. An African-American man stepped off a train shortly after this in Memphis. He was a field secretary for the NAACP, James Weldon Johnson. One of the challenges of these incidents is the white community tend to ignore it, forget it, play it down. And he was not going to let that happen. He spent almost 2 weeks in Memphis at the risk to his own life, interviewing people, gathering evidence, wrote a scathing article that year about what had happened in Memphis, Tennessee. He also gave us one of the most haunting quotes from this period. Before he left Memphis, he stood there where L persons had been burned, and he said he feared for Black America's body and white America's soul. But through education, the NAACP, African Americans were starting to fight back. 2 years later, in Northeast Arkansas, a group of African Americans met in a church. They were deciding on ways to unionize. We don't know exactly how the shots first fired, but some whites gathered outside the church. Shots were fired. A white railroad police officer was killed. And from that incident, word suddenly spread throughout Arkansas, Missouri, Tennessee, Mississippi. The African Americans were up in revolt. The governor led forces down there. Whites poured into that area simply for the purpose of shooting and killing African Americans. But the word reached the White House. President Wilson, no supporter of equal rights, sent the United States Army in there. A historian has done very meticulous research on this. He identified what happened in 2 places he called killing fields. In one place, the United States Army troops simply went through, and anytime they saw an African American, they killed him. Eyewitnesses hear the rat-tat-tat of the machine gun as he went through. In another place, African American families, dads, moms, and their children, had huddled for safety in the cane breaks. The United States Army set up machine guns and fired away. Remember what the United States Army was doing in Memphis. Remember what it did in the 1950s, 1960s. And look what it was doing in 1919. No one was ever arrested. There were no persecutions. But Walter Wright, field secretary of the NAACP, showed up to report and gather evidence, just as his compatriot had done in Memphis, and again published a scathing report what had happened in Elaine. And it wasn't only African American men stepping up. Ida B. Jones Barnett, she shows up, and she focuses on what had happened, and specifically on what we call the Elaine 12. 12 African Americans falsely accused of committing murder as a result of this, and they were tried for murder with the intention of having them sentenced to be death. I've stood in the courtroom where those trials happened. I also stood in the jury room. It still exists to this day. These 12 juries started competing with each other to see how fast they could come up with a guilty verdict. The best time was 6 minutes, and sentenced them to death. Another African American steps up at this point, Scipio Jones, a lawyer. He fights this all the way. The case ends up all the way in the Supreme Court. They have to be retried. They're released. They still have 6, which ended up being prosecuted, again, falsely. But Scipio Jones doesn't give up. He keeps pushing it. And right before an Arkansas governor leaves office, Jones is so persuasive that his white governor lets them go, because the person that was elected to replace him was an avowed member of the Ku Klux Klan, who said in first day of office, he was going to execute those 6 African-American men. Now, I'd like to say that things got better in the 20s and 30s and onward, but the problems that we see in the 1600s continuing forward, the issues we saw in 1908, continue on for the decades. In 1986, in a small Alabama town, on a Saturday morning, several customers came into a laundromat. It was attended by a young 15-year-old girl. When the customers came in at 10:45, she was lying down. She had 3 bullet holes in her back. The police, in investigating this a year later, decided to arrest a black man named Walter McMillan, successful businessman. Their key witness was one white man. And despite the fact that multiple African Americans said they had been with Walter at the time of the murder, even one who was a police officer, they were able to convince the all-white jury in the testimony of one white man who said he was with Walter in there, he saw him have the gun, and he was guilty of the crime. The jury came back with life imprisonment. But Alabama actually had a law, which they've since rescinded, where a judge can override it and sentence him to death. It was exactly what this judge did. 4 times the case was appealed and denied. Then a young African-American lawyer, 28 years old, Brian Stevenson, entered the case. When he told people after he graduated from Harvard he wanted to set up a law practice in Alabama, you can imagine the reaction of some people. Why would you go there? What do you hope to achieve? But he's vowed any time he knows of a death penalty case, he's going to take it on free of charge. And this was his first major case. So the first thing he went to was to those 3 white men, the sheriff, Alabama Bureau of Investigations, and another police officer had really gathered the evidence for the case. And he went to the current DA. It was a different DA than the other one. He said, I want all the evidence that you gathered. I suspect that some of it was not given to the defense as it should have. In a very contentious meeting, the DA agreed. Stevenson found evidence after evidence of evidence that white man told numerous people that he wasn't there. He had nothing to do with this. And after he got through all the papers, Stevenson took a tape. He played the tape. It was the 3 white officers with this white man who had been arrested for another murder. And you hear the confession that Walter was, in fact, at that laundromat. But Brian, to his credit, then took that tape, he flipped it over, and he played the other side. And then he got to hear the conversations that occurred before that. So when they brought in this white man, he said he had nothing to do with it. He wasn't at the laundromat. And they kept pressuring him to the point that they threatened that he was going to be not life imprisonment, but the death penalty if he didn't agree with their story. And so he recanted. So when he took the oath in the Holy Bible, he gave a story that was completely fabricated by those 3 white officers. So Stevenson immediately went for a trial. 3 days he presented this evidence. The trial only lasted a day and a half. And that last day he presented that tape. And after he did that, the DA stood up. The judge asked the DA if he had any rebuttal, and he said no. And a few days later, Walter McMillan was released from death row. Again, I like to say this has a happy ending. But he was asked, why was he put on death row? He said, I used to date a white woman, and my son married a white woman. But he said why he was on death row 7 times. He was present for the executions. And he said you could smell the burning flesh in his cell as this was going on. He suffered depression and dementia, as one could expect, for the rest of his life. But I suggest to you the real legacy of 1908 is African Americans standing up and pushing back against the philosophy that was created in the 1600s. Whether it's a Harvard-educated lawyer, whether it's a lawyer in Arkansas, a woman touring through Arkansas, a field secretary stepping off a train in Memphis or Arkansas, or a 23-year-old pastor standing on the gallows before over 100 white people calling for the death of a 17-year-old musician. It's that black agency and stepping up that is a true legacy of 1908 and truly makes it a story of national significance. Thank you. Okay, we have some time for some questions if anyone has any. If you don't, I completely understand as well. Yes, Susan.
Would you be willing to pull all of that history forward to Springfield and the Mass Foundation?
Yeah, I'd be happy to help any way I can for that. And I also met Brian Stevenson. I had, when we were working on a marker in Memphis, we got pushback from both the state of Tennessee and the city of Memphis. And Tim Townsend, a dear friend and former workers here, he knew Brian Stevenson. He's a Brian Stevenson fan. And he kept telling me, hey, why don't you email Brian Stevenson? I'm like, Stevenson's not going to take my email, Tim. I mean, he doesn't know me from Adam. But he's very relentless. So I went ahead and I emailed Brian, and a week later I got a response. He said, yeah, come meet with me. I'm like, okay. So I tried to get him to come with me. He was too horrified to meet one of his heroes, so he didn't come with me. So I just went down there by myself and met him and his staff. And I explained that Tennessee Historical Commission had voted down our sign, which was historically accurate. And the city of Memphis said, you're not going to put the sign up anywhere in Memphis. And he said, you know, I know somebody that might be able to help you. There was an African-American judge in the U.S. Court of Appeals. And he actually set up for me to have a meeting with her. And I've been working with other lawyers and other people. We went into her chambers, long table, she's sitting at the end. I ended up sitting to her left. And it was interesting watching how the lawyers' disposition changed. You know, with me, they're joking around. They got into her, and they were just dead quiet, just for, yes, ma'am, yes, Your Honor, everything like this. Well, I got a little carried away in my frustration, and she just gently put her hand on me. She said, Tim, I used to teach the mayor in law school. And a few days later, the city of Memphis suddenly changed their mind. They approved the marker and put it in. So it was a joy getting to know him. I certainly would want to add that to the story as well, that he was able to intervene. And again, it was an African-American judge that put the pressure on, to our credit, to get this marker in place. To this day, the Tennessee Historical Commission refuses to approve the wording that we put on that sign. But yes, I'd be willing to help any way I can, Susan. And thanks for all your help, in this as well. Any other questions? Yes.
It was hard to listen to this. Thank you for your point of telling the story. I think the real emotional about the history that is mine of this country. The story needs to be told by you, by people like you. Otherwise, it won't be heard. And that is so unfortunate. What is also unfortunate is that one time a year, the story is told. This church should be full of people that need to hear it. Change will not come until people of all hues stand up and say, no more, never again. In Jesus' name. Thank you.
Very well said, thanks. I don't necessarily enjoy giving these talks, and I understand that because when you talk about it, you got to relive it all over again. But I really appreciate your comment. I completely agree with you. Just because it depresses us and we're shocked by it and horrified it, doesn't mean we should ignore it. And I could stand up here for days talking about lynchings, going back to the 1850s, going forward. And each story is just absolutely heartbreaking. For those of you, if you have a chance to go down to what Brian Stevenson has put together in Montgomery, Alabama, he's got an exhibit on slavery, extremely well done, on a lynching. And the last time I was down there, I did not know they lynched children in front of their parents. Again, trying to make the point, hey, we're in control. But can you imagine being a parent and not being able to protect your child while this is going on? This also has antecedents back in the time of slavery. When I was doing some research in 1860, I was looking at some South Carolina newspapers, and I typically look at the advertisements. And this is the first time I was reading a Southern newspaper, and it occurred to me there'd be slave advertisements in the back, and there were. But what I didn't understand at the time, you'd see the word mulatto with several of the slave advertisements. So this, of course, means lighter skin. And I just couldn't understand why. What difference would that make? So I emailed one of my professors, and he came back to me and said, Tim, if you go back, look at those advertisements, it's all going to be women. And I went back, he was right. Imagine being a parent, you have a teenage girl, and you know she's heading to the auction block, and what's going to happen. And I read this in the Lincoln-Douglas debates. One of Douglas's points was we have to keep slavery. So as he put it, we won't have the mixing of the races. Lincoln's response, which I didn't know when I first read it, was like, well, if you want to stop that, end slavery. He knew, Douglas knew what was going on. And think about it. Lincoln and Douglas were able to say this in Illinois in 1858, a free state. That's how well Americans knew what was going on down there. And so you see this practice of trying to keep parents down, and that extends into the lynching period as well. Any other questions? I'll go over here. Sarah? No, that's fine, Sarah. Okay, good. Yeah.
That we have to demand that the stories be told, which means going to the school board, correct? Speaking to the school board and saying, our children need to hear this. Citizens of Springfield need to hear this because you don't know, you do it again. When you know better, you do better.
Amen. So, yeah.
So I guess I don't know about this. You may have an answer for something else, Mike. But you know, with the race riot, a large part of the destruction was the black churches.
Yes.
And so I'm curious about religious life for African Americans who remained in Springfield after the race riots. Where did they adopt a new church? Did they worship at home? I don't know if you know anything about that more recently.
Yeah, I can only speak for Holy Trinity, which sadly closed this month. But Doswell continued to hold services there. The church was not affected, and he continued to hold services there with his congregation. So, yep.
Black people don't rely on buildings. We pray in our homes. Many churches in Springfield started in somebody's home, in their kitchens. So you burn down the church, you can't burn down the God that is within us. That will never end. So no, churches were burned, yes, but people still practice and pray together and build another church.
Okay, Audra, I've been passing you by. You want to? Yeah, go ahead. And then, Brian, I'll get to you in a minute. Okay.
I just have a quick question on why you think hatred towards black people still exists. There's still lynchings happening to this day down in Mississippi. Just a couple, I think like maybe a week or two ago, someone was lynched there. You still have police brutality. A child, a toddler, 1-year-old got shot in a suspected shoplifting case. Children are being killed. Black people are being killed because of their skin color. They're getting bigger sentences because of their skin color. And this hatred keeps happening over and over and over again. Even, and I will say from my personal experience, even in private schools. I went to Trinity Lutheran for 5th to 8th grade. I was called the N-word. I was called a nigger. I was called a nigger. I was told that I should be a slave, that I should wear chains because of the color of my skin. I should in the back of the bus still because I am black, and that I should never learn math because I'm black. Why do you think that's so happened?
Audra's one of our members. She won the essay contest, so I want to. She wrote an excellent essay, and if you want to hear someone sing, you've got to hear the voice God gave her. It is extraordinary. So Audra, let me attempt to answer that with an experience that I had. So as part of the commemoration of the Memphis massacre, when I went down there was a private school down there, I think the world of a professor, and he regularly teaches evening classes for adults. Now, you don't get credit or anything like this. These are just people that want to learn. And he invited me down just to attend. And of all the commemorations for the 1860 massacre, this was the only one where the entire group was white. And I noticed it was a safe setting. They could ask questions, they could make statements they may have been very uncomfortable making in other groups, and I really appreciated their honesty. And one of the big issues that they were struggling with was whether slavery was the cause of the war, and also this idea of white supremacy. So I was sitting towards the back. That's where I usually prefer to sit in church, but of course I got to sit up front now. But I noticed there was a guy up front. He didn't say anything, but boy, he was zeroed in on the conversation. Now, he was about 10, 20 years older than me. And I went up to him and I exchanged information. And we started an email correspondence. And I started sending him historical information, especially from the secession conventions. Many of the states had secession conventions to vote on leaving the Union. If you read the minutes, it's all about slavery. It's all about slavery. 40% of America's wealth was invested in enslaved African Americans. 60% of our foreign trade was tied to enslaved African Americans. It's all about an economic model and a white supremacy philosophy. The last email he sent me was, he politely said, okay, I've got all the information, I don't need any more. But he said the struggle for him, here he was in the winter of his life, and he's got to look back and ask himself, why did my parents lie to me? Why did my teachers lie to me? Why did my grandparents lie to me? So it was a personal struggle for him to accept, which was clear in the historical documentation. Now, I had no such burden. I cannot relate to that. But for him, he has to reconcile with his family about everything that has happened to him. So, Audra, I think that's part of the struggle. You got to turn. Now, I was down in Louisiana State one time, and we had a wonderful discussion with the white students and black students on race. And one of the students stood up in the thickest Southern accent you can imagine, said, I love my daddy, but I don't agree with everything he says. There was a generational break there. And it was a positive development to see he was willing to make that break. I'll give you another example. One of the people that pushed the hardest to talk about the Elaine massacre, and Brian back then is an expert in this, knows far more than I do. One of them was a white man who grew up there. But as he did the research more and more, he started to have this horrendous feeling that his grandfather who raised him actually participated. And he came to the conclusion that he did. He was a member of the Klan, and he supported what had been done. And even though his African-American friends pleaded with him not to separate himself from it, he could not. He found it irreconcilable to accept his grandfather because of what he had done. And here he was, again, in the winter of his life, having to turn his back on his family because of what they had done, which he didn't know why he was being raised there. I think, Audra, and this is not an excuse. This is not an excuse. But there's some emotional issues that's really hard. But how many as white Americans realize they're following along a philosophy for people long dead in an economic system that's long gone? And this is the reason they're doing this. They just wake up and say, why are you continuing to perpetuate something that's no longer around? So you keep speaking up, Audra. I will always take it. Sure, go ahead, Susan, go ahead. And then Brian, you're next. Okay. All right. All right. All right.
My name is Susan Phillips. I'm pastor for Presbyterian, and it was my honor to serve on the Massey Commission. The system is not law. The economic system that enriches white folks at the expense of black and brown folks is alive and well. It is alive and well in this community. When I came here 9 years ago, and I got a tour like, oh, Springfield is literally divided by the tracks. In other communities, that's metaphorical. Here it's real. And the disparities are economic, they're educational, they're financial, and they're political. The east side of Springfield is over-policed, it is under-resourced, and it is intentional. And one of the ways that white supremacy perpetuates itself is that white folks teach each other to forget what's real. We do that here. And racism isn't going to end until white folks own it and commit ourselves to dismantling it. So here in Springfield, we don't want to use the word lynchings for today. But black folks experience violence at much higher rates. Poor folks experience violence at much higher rates today. It isn't past, it's now. So if you're feeling anything about maybe I need to do something, please go to the county website, to the Massey Commission calls to action. There are 26 of them. None of them are window dressing, none of them are fluff. All of them are about how we dismantle the disparities that exist in this community today and make for a more just community. There is something for everyone to get involved with. And I will say nobody has an excuse for not finding something on that list and committing yourselves to making this community more fair and more just. Please.
Thanks, Susan. Thank you. Brian?
That's good, and thank you, Pastor I wanted to first answer Edie's question about black churches.
Please do.
I am a historian and currently doing research on the 1908. Although there were rumors that lots of black churches were burned down, there weren't a whole bunch of black churches that were burned down. So black congregations met those parishioners who stayed. Most of the pastors, fearing for their lives, leave. So deacons and under pastors ran the church in
All right. Well, thanks so much, Brian. Always good hearing from you. Catherine, I'm going to let you have the last word because Austin and I'll send some closing remarks. Well, let me let Catherine. Go ahead, Catherine.
I just wanted to invite everyone who have not been to the Springfield and Central Illinois African American History Museum at 1440 Monument Avenue across from the gates at Oak Ridge Cemetery. Please come.
Yes, well, and tomorrow, one of our members you'll be reading your essay, right, Audra? Tomorrow, one of our members will be reading the essay. Doris? Very well said. Very well.
And it's noted in the brochure that I passed out.
Someday I'm going to get Catherine to speak up, and that'll be... Okay, Austin wants to say a few words. He's president of NAACP and someone I think the world of.
Thank you. Good afternoon. God is good. God is good. Let me hear it again. God is good. We are all God's children. Racism is nothing new. White supremacy is nothing new. Hatred is nothing new. Tim can speak on all of that. It's in the Bible. Take the time to listen, learn, and do something. Teach your children, your grandchildren, and anyone you meet to change, to help, and to fight the battle. We all suffer. We all lose. But the goal is to help each other, to come together, and have unity and peace on earth. The NAACP helps and works with everyone. We are responsible. We know the history, some of us. Our job is to teach and plan and prepare for the future. We must vote. We know what's going on today. It is not just black people, white people, foreigners, immigrants. Why? I ask you the question, why? There's a purpose, there's an agenda. Your job is to fix it, to help, participate, and make life better for all. Our goal is to make sure we don't forget, we remember, we make it public so that the mistakes of the past will not happen in the future. We ask you to pray with us, work with us, and come together. Thank you, and keep coming and keep working.
For the longest time, I thought Austin was a pastor, but he claims he is not. So So he asked me if we can close in prayer. So let's please bow your heads. Dear Heavenly Father, I want to thank you for bringing us together this day, and thank you for all the blessings you have given to us, especially the gift of education. We ask that you continue to guide us, that we may look back at our difficult past and still learn from it and apply it today. We also want to thank you for those who have stepped up to push back against this. Brian Stevens, Scipio Jones, Ida B. Jones Barnett, Walter White, and Reverend Doswell. Thank you for empowering them to stand up and fight against this sin which infects our country today. Continue to also remind us that you know suffering as we look at the cross, and you also know resurrection by looking at an empty tomb. And guide us always to keep those at the forefront, that we may gather one day all together in your glory on the last day. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.